In science, you get feedback from the bacteria, like the real world, right? So like targets are different. The thing that you're measuring is not like, did the customer buy it? Did they click on it? Did they do, right? Like, did they interact? It's like, did the bacteria die? Did the bacteria produce the thing I wanted them to? Did they produce it more than before? Again, that's still in an engineering context. In like a basic science context, again, you want to design your experiments in a way that is going to be like informative to your ultimate goal, right? So did it glow or not? Did it move here or not? Like, did it live or die?
Welcome to Productside Stories, the podcast where we reveal the very real and raw lessons learned from product leaders and thinkers all over the world. I'm your host, Rina Alexin, CEO of Productside. Let's dive into today's episode. And today I'll be speaking with Dr. Christina Agapakis, a synthetic biologist, writer, and creative leader whose career lives at the intersection of biology, design, and storytelling. Christina is the founder of Oscillator and the former SVP of Creative and Marketing at Ginkgo Bioworks. She's known for translating complex scientific concepts into cultural stories and experiences that resonate. I'm thrilled to have her here to talk about what scientists can learn from product management and vice versa. Welcome to the pod, Christina.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Well, Christina, you are a very unique person for me to interview. We don't normally get scientists on this show. With that, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your story and how did you end up becoming the founder of Oscillator?
Thanks. I think it is a little bit weird, my path, I'd say. I did start out as a biologist, just obsessed with biochemistry, honestly, like how cells made energy and made things and made organisms, and particularly microbiology, like what microbes can do in the world and with our bodies and in the environment. I wanted to do that forever. And so I started a PhD in biology. And I ended up meeting a professor who was doing synthetic biology. And I had never heard of synthetic biology. I was like, well, what are you doing? What does it mean to be synthetic and biology at the same time? She's like, well, I'm a biologist, but synthetic biology is all about designing living things, designing biology to solve big problems, to solve climate change, to make new kinds of medicines, to do things in the world. And that was really exciting to me. This idea that like the stuff I loved about biochemistry, like how enzymes work and how microbes do things, like could actually start to be applied to solve these big problems. And so I became a synthetic biologist. Like I joined the lab and I started doing projects in biofuels, applying kind of biochemistry, the metabolism of microbes to creating fuels that could be used for everything. Though what ended up happening to me in that process is sort of like learning about like what sort of determines all of these things that happen in the world. How do people make choices? What are the kind of like policy implications? What happens when new kinds of fuels or technologies kind of enter these very complicated geopolitical things that happen when we're talking about climate change and energy? And I kept being like, I don't know, guys, this seems like a bigger thing than enzymes and like what I can do at the bench. And there was a sense, I think, from the sort of scientists and the engineers, again, like the point was to solve these problems, but we knew that they were just too big and like beyond what we could really do. So there was a sense of like, don't worry about that. Like, just think about your enzymes. Like, it just didn't feel right to me. And so like, I spent a lot of time like, reading and learning and trying to figure out like, what do I do as a scientist who like wants to really understand and solve problems in the real world? Like when we are pointing our research into the real world, like what does it take to do that translation? And I found like this whole world, right, of design, of product, of social studies of science, of the sort of like political and economic and like real cultural dimensions of how science translates. And that is like a really, really interesting and big and messy world. And so I didn't really, anyway, I spent a lot of time like just trying to learn and read and write and think. And like that reading and writing and thinking like turned into collaborations with designers, a blog about synthetic biology in the world, interesting kinds of new sorts of projects, and led me eventually to work at Ginkgo in marketing, which is again, like, where does the science interface with the world? What are the things that we need to do to like be in the world? What are the stories we're telling about the future and about those like the actual things that happen to be able to translate that science into impact?
Yeah, so I love your story. And honestly, I have also the same kind of reaction. What is synthetic biology? It's like an oxymoron, right?
Yeah.
but but essentially what you are saying really resonates with me and I think with our audience, because in product, we often, I think we use a lot of very similar, I will say, like scientific exploration methods, where at the end you have to be curious, you have to know how to experiment, but you also need to have this also commercial view. And so I'm curious because it sounds like, you know, given your background in biology, but also your understanding of marketing, your work has really helped you just understand the two sides of research, but also application in the real world and the commercial implications of that. So maybe you can share a little bit about some of the parallels you see having been on both sides of like, I guess, is it sides of science and product?
Yeah, actually, like I like maybe that's a funny thing for us to sort of like keep unpacking and exploring, right? Like, what is that edge? Like, what are they sides? Are they a continuum? Like, are they like a messy, tangled, like hairball of things of sort of going back and forth? Um, I think I think as a scientist, like when you're sort of like, I'm a scientist, I do basic research, I care about science, like we do like really put up a wall between kind of science and its application and like the world, right? It really is separate things and it's separate kinds of work to think about how it might be applied and how it might become technology. And we often think of like the technology kind of part and innovation and applied science is like, that's a little bit downstream from science. And then downstream from that, like maybe then you start thinking about the commercialization, like, okay, wait, who is going to buy it? And then maybe after that, you'll think about marketing. Like, what's the story? How do we talk to people? And I think actually, like, my experience over time has been like, it's actually the big tangled mess, right? Like, we are thinking about and worrying about like that kind of story, how people make sense of new technologies, how people think about in the context of bioengineering, genetic engineering, synthetic biology, how do they think about GMOs and GMO technology, and how that it gets into their daily life. Those are stories that are very salient to us and they influence the way that we might think about the scientific questions we're asking, even at a very basic level. And then in the technology side too, again, like we have to be thinking about like, where is the money coming from to be able to like invest into research and development of new kinds of technologies. How will people use these kinds of things? Where are they going? Like there's always this kind of tangle up of everything, right? Like there's even a back and forth with the science, right? Like new kinds of technologies give us access to new kinds of things. Like we can see into cells in a different way than we could have before, right? We can ask new kinds of questions as scientists. And we can make new kinds of products as engineers and as in a sort of industry context, right? I think we're always thinking about all of these all the time and then always kind of like putting up barriers in between them. I'm not sure if that's your question, which is like, what is the polarity?
Because I think there's really a lot in what you're saying, and when I see it in non-science world, right, in the enterprise space, for example, I see very similar types of walls being kind of potentially built around like the engineering and the technology department, as well as product and marketing, from the perspective of actually then almost exactly as how you outlined it. It's like, here's this cool thing, here are the implications of what we can now do. But then only downstream do we start thinking about the people who might use it or buy it. And I think a company gets into a lot of trouble sometimes when the technology is that forcing function versus a clear understanding of how are people going to then use and pay for it because they find it valuable. Whereas maybe in some a more science-based research, the money comes from grants and curiosity around specific questions that might be bigger than an immediate commercial application. So it's like it's different constraints when it's a private company versus funded research. But the process is what I'm interested in. Does the process completely change because of those constraints? Or do you see that there are still, because there should be some benefit ultimately to an end user or end consumer from even the grant research type of funding model. So there should be something there.
I think often, like in the grants, right? Like there is often a downstream impact kind of considered. Like the more we can understand about the processes of what's happening inside of a cell, like that actually helps us understand things about disease progression. Often, again, it's linked in that way. Or like the more I can understand about the metabolism of certain kinds of weird microbes, actually like that could point us towards different kinds of processes that could be used in an industrial capacity. So again, often there is that sort of link to a kind of very far downstream application beyond that sort of like the negative of like, oh, we create all these boundaries and that's similar across. Maybe the other thing that's kind of been interesting to me in thinking about kind of both like really the nitty gritty of the process of scientific discovery and the nitty gritty process of like product discovery and kind of like the design process, we often have very kind of like simplified model. You can draw a little diagram of what the process looks like, right? So the scientific method, you are going to like observe something, you're going to come up with a hypothesis, you're going to experiment that hypothesis, you're going to like get results and analyze them, and that's going to like bring you new observation, and the cycle repeats. I think you have a similar kind of thing that, people draw different lines, like, you can call it design thinking, you can call it product discovery, you can call it anything, but there's a similar kind of structural, like there's little arrows and there's very sort of simplified schematic. You can put it on a PowerPoint slide. But then like I've had this experience now to also teaching, and I'm curious if you've had this experience, like where the students are like, you're not actually teaching me how to do these things. You're just like telling me to do them. Like, and I'm realizing like, that's actually right. Like it's really hard to actually explain like what happens in your brain when you are coming up with a hypothesis. What happens when you're like, kind of like, I don't want, that doesn't feel right, I'm going to try this other thing. Or like, what happens when you're kind of testing, not that hypothesis yet, like, but even like kind of checking it against like what people have done before. You Google the question, right? You see how other people, like the methods that they've used to sort of talk about that question. It's not a straightforward, simple loop, right? Like there's all of these things. So I think there's more, what I'm saying is there's more parallels than there are differences.
I think you're right. And by the way, when we do talk about design thinking, the PowerPoint slide that we do bring up is not neat whatsoever. In fact, it represents essentially what you might be alluding to, the tangled mess, which is the reality is there is this sterile way of viewing design thinking where you you go from each stage to one to the other and then you come up with the answer, but that's not how it happens. You always go back, you always find something new, and you set yourself up on various paths depending on that information that comes up. And I think that's what you're talking about. That truly is what scientific discovery feels like as well, where you might start somewhere with a hypothesis of where you're going, and where you end up is completely different because of that new information that arises.
Absolutely.
I still think that there is something here for us to kind of talk about, which is maybe it's the culture aspect. And I don't know. So I don't know how the scientific world operates, but I'm curious because you brought up this idea around silos, and silos can, in some ways, they try to organize how people think and work together. That's why they come up. They try to, I think most people have silos in an effort to be helpful to the organization. And then there's actually impedance on the outcomes generated because people are stopped talking to each other, or some other process or something comes in the way. What do you think in terms of having experienced scientific exploration and then marketing? I would imagine you work differently in a marketing team than you do on a research team. And right? And so maybe we can talk a little bit about how those two types of teams operate and what they can maybe learn from each other?
So fun. Gosh, it's such a big question. I do like the point where you're saying about like, I do think that there is clearly a utility in silos, right? And sort of like being able to like name a practice, like articulate it, and like talk about like what happens at the transitions between these different kinds of teams or things that need to operate. It's funny because I think my sort of experience has been so gradually kind of moving from research to marketing that I'm almost like a frog in the water. It was always the same, like again, and often with the same people. I'm sitting in the room with like some scientists, like we're trying to figure out like this interesting problem. We're trying to apply it. Like we're kind of like, we sort of see a problem. We have a kind of goal in mind. We see the kind of issues and observe. And then we're like, let's try something out. Like, what about this? And you would kind of like push on each other and try something out, see how it goes, like do it. Like, I think the tactics look very different, right? So like, 20 years ago when I was in the lab and the guys and I were chatting, let's go see what happens if we like got that gene and put it into the E. coli. Like, I wonder if what would happen if, and like when I'm in marketing, I'm like, there's a story here like that we should write an op-ed about this or that, or like, oh, what if I made a sticker that had this funny thing on it, right? Or at the conference, like people would really resonate with something like this, right? So like the tactics are different in the kind of like marcoms, whatever. Or even on the product side. And the product side is actually where they're exactly meeting, right? So like some of the work I was doing at Ginkgo a couple of years ago was even thinking about like, what are the ways we work in lab to generate data? And how does generating data, like now it needs to be a product that people can actually buy and access. Like scientists want to make better AI models. They need better data for those models. Like, how do we like build trustworthy data sets? How do we do data generation as a service? Now that starts to look pretty similar. Like, oh, what if we tried this cell type? Like, would lots of people be able to use that? Would it get us that kind of high quality data? Like, how do you think about this? Like, and again, partnering kind of across specializations like happens immediately, right? So it's not even silos, but like everybody has such like unique specialized skill sets in a lab context and in an industry context. Like, I know a guy who knows this or that, or like, oh, we have to talk to this person. She knows so much about like do CRISPR screens in mammalian cells. Oh, we have to talk up to this person. She's the best at sequencing microbial genomes. And so like you're always kind of finding like the specific expertise, like, and trying to kind of synthesize across like all of those people's constraints towards some kind of output.
So is that what you were doing when you were in a lab? Because what you're describing does very much sound like a product process to me.
Yeah, I mean, both, right? Like I'm saying, like in the lab, it would be like, okay, I want to, well, especially because we were doing synthetic biology, it was like, I want to make a bacteria that can produce hydrogen. Like, okay, like I need to find this piece that can do that. Like, let's test it out. Like, let's try this one. Oh, that didn't work for this. Like, let's keep kind of assembling the parts. Here's a prototype. How does it operate in this context? Like, oh, let's try that again, right? Like, and then that it was very much a kind of iterative engineering kind of product process. The other one was explicitly a product process.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
The reason why I asked that is because I'm just curious. You know, in a lab environment, again, without a specific user in mind, you might be asking very similar types of questions, designing similar types of experiments. Right. That's what we're talking about. I mean, we talk about it all the time in our class, like the "how might we" statements, right? To create the hypothesis, and then what is the small type of investment you can make in an experiment. But there's a difference, I think, with commercially applicable or even not commercially applicable, because there are IT teams that might not have be selling something to someone, but they have end users, versus how like they get feedback from the market.
Yeah.
You don't have that.
In science,
market.
you get feedback from the bacteria, the real world, right? So like, or your targets are different, right? So, and like the thing that you're measuring, it's not like, did the customer buy it? Did they click on it? Did they do, right? Like, did they interact? It's like, did the bacteria die? Did the bacteria produce the thing I wanted them to? Did they produce it more than before? Again, that's still in an engineering context. In like a basic science context, again, like you want to design your experiments in a way that is going to be like informative to your ultimate goal, right? So often it is something like, did it glow or not? Did it move here or not? Like, did it live or die? Did this thing, is it related to this? Like, did it bump into this? Did they connect to each other here? You're trying to, again, like set up an experiment where the outcome gives you something informative about the fundamental nature of what's going on. When I delete this gene, the cell, does something weird. Like,
Sure.
what happens? Yeah.
Yeah, so the results are your feedback.
The results of the feedback.
Okay, so then let me then ask this question. Are there any true differences in the way that a product team might be exploring a question versus the way a science team would be exploring it?
I think at like some fundamental, like abstract level, I don't think so. I think that that ultimately like iterative exploration of the world is fundamental, and fundamental to how we understand things and like make sense of the world and make things in the world. And so whether you're doing that again in a company trying to sell some widget or whatever, like, or you're a scientist trying to uncover something, or you're just a normal person trying to do normal things, like, make stuff happen in your life, we are constantly trying to sort of getting feedback from things that we're doing in the world. Right. And so I think there is something very foundational, fundamental, that is very, very similar.
Do you find that there could be, I don't know, mindsets or practices that the scientific community could learn from the product community, given that at this point, I'm ready to kind of like announce to the product community, y'all are scientists.
Y'all are scientists. A difference is in sort of like the boundaries of our curiosity and the sort of like directionality of like where are the scope and like the scales that we try to bridge, right? I think it's really hard to kind of bridge across like a molecular scale and like a human commercial scale, right? So like if I'm asking a question of like what is happening when this gene turns on, and how does that impact the ultimate behavior of the cell, it's hard to then say, what does that mean for like the economy of like agriculture? Like that's sort of a difficult bridge to jump. And I think vice versa, right? Like if you're trying a product marketing manager trying to think about like introducing a new food product on the market, like it's hard to now say like, oh, what's happening at the molecular level of here beyond like what might matter again to a consumer. The ability to kind of like bridge some of those scales, or like in particular to care about the human and commercial scale, I think like is a domain that lives more in marketing than it does in science. Like I think in science we're much more comfortable at the molecular or the like universe scale, right? Like, and then it's like hard to bridge into like, what does it mean? Like, yeah. And so I think when you're asking around like the feedback, the user feedback, I think like that's often like just too far for most scientific people to sort of think and like to kind of get into the theory of mind of a consumer or like somebody else is very hard for scientists. Whereas like we do sort of like get into the minds of molecules literally, but thinking about how somebody might understand this in their daily life as a product is often too far. And sometimes I think we kind of deliberately put that wall up and say like, oh, that's not for me. I can't do that. I don't think that's true. I think we can be thinking, but it's hard, and there are kind of constraints on us, I'd say. So yeah. Think about people. And that's the advice.
Think about people. Well, I think that makes a really, really good point. We kind of talked a little bit at the start about funding models. The question I have here is like, how does research come about, right? Like who's funding it? Who's asking these questions? What is the source? What's the point, right, at the end? Because the point for a product, it's to solve a useful problem out in the market, whereby that company, by solving that problem, gets to grow and have value and have revenue. Whereas with the scientific exploration, it really depends. And I think given what a lot of the American public has been seeing also about various scientific experiments that they would or would not want to fund, it's a good question around like what is behind what gets funded and what gets researched, and what's the point of that?
You're asking the right questions, and I think like huge questions, actually. Um, uh, there's a similar kind of force at play here. As scientists, we have this sense of like, oh, there is a sort of purity and objectivity to the practice of science. Like it is about like curiosity, free of anything else, free of human subjectivity as much as possible, free of politics, and like free of like the need to have a sort of applied outcome. And that is not true and has never been true about science, because somebody, if there's the kind of science that happened in the olden days where there's like a rich guy just doing it for the love of the game, there's a politics to that. Like, what are the kinds of questions that like make sense to a person like that? Like, what are the questions that matter? How have they come to a lifestyle where they can do that? Are all interesting kind of questions that you can start to ask and think about the context of that science. In the context of the last 100 years, in the United States in particular, like science was very deliberately funded, like as part of a social contract of like funding basic research, like will lead to economic strength and military strength. If we invest in these kind of basic research questions, like it is deliberately because it makes our nation more economically, politically, and militarily powerful. We may not be able to predict the direct line between them, but there's kind of an equation of like, well, the more money we put in, like the more science there is, the more defense power and the more economic power there is on the other, because somebody will figure out how to translate that science into something impactful. The government agencies that fund that science like have ideas about what that looks like. What are the kinds of research that are going to be the kinds of things that, in the case of healthcare and basic research in biology, like a pharmaceutical company will be able to apply it and translate it into a drug that people can buy in a way that is like a financially viable for them to exist as a business and helps grow the health and well-being of the population. They're big questions about like kind of fundamentally like what is a social contract, like what is our belief in like what it makes for a good life and like what is a good society and a good country, and we invest in those. That is now like changing very dramatically before our very eyes. And I think a lot of that, we're coming to a realization of like these conversations are about what matters to us and what future we want to live in, and like what are the constraints of our like society, our economy, and our institutions that make it hard or easy to translate certain things versus others into impact.
Yeah, you might not like my next question because it's also going to be a big one, but I love your answers.
Like big questions.
I love your answers. I think they're important. I mean, I'm glad you and I are having this discussion. I can imagine a lot of people in the US and globally should be having these kinds of discussions, because I think that there's a place and a space for product management type thinking in the scientific community, because what you just said, I mean, somebody has to make that downstream link eventually, right? And so the way that I think product people think about it is they try to really understand the market, right? Like who are we serving? I mean, the personas. Do you use personas in science? Like, are there? There's a question: are there personas in science? Yeah.
Not explicitly. I think often, again, like there may be like implicitly, like there's a patient that you might want to understand at the end. But again, like often it's abstracted down to like, okay, there's a patient who has this physiological like situation. We're rarely thinking about like the patient holistically. Who are they? How are they living? Like, what are the other kinds of impacts that their condition is having on them? How might a drug like be part of that world? It's so hard to do science. Like it's hard to make drugs. It's hard to do this kind of research. Part of it is like what's the bridge? What's the dialogue between the people who are thinking about that at that level, and how can we have better conversations there too? I think that has to be part of it. Anyway, keep going.
I know that. I mean, I guess that's the point I'm also trying to make. We're aligned. We're like very much aligned on this. Given the importance of thinking about and people. The other part that I was thinking in when you were talking is the funding model. And at a company, you fund a lot of what we like to like encourage people to do is fund a lot of small bets, But in the scientific community, I think some of these bets are quite large as well. And so that, a company would not be the right funder of that.
Yeah.
because I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine that most scientific explorations fail.
Yeah.
On purpose. Like they come out with a result where, that hypothesis is disproven and therefore it's not a viable, observation. Could I put it?
Yeah. Like there's a lot of these things are not going to become the winner, like the thing that's on the market, the thing that everyone uses. I think you're totally right. And I think that's actually like an interesting thing that's happening now. And some of the stuff I'm most excited about is also like there are a lot of really interesting organizations that I've been working with and collaborating with now in sort of my new world, like no longer at Ginkgo and now at Oscillator, a kind of independent consultancy. We're partnering with a lot of different organizations who are thinking about exactly these questions. Like, how should we be funding, incentivizing research, thinking about new ways of doing this to fill some of the gaps that seem to exist, right? Like exactly what you're saying, right? Like there are certain kinds of scientific work that are not really ready for like the kinds of pressures that a startup is under to like hit commercial milestones, but need a kind of startup like focused effort. So like this is now something that people are doing called focused research organizations. Again, trying to create a new kind of institution that's funded in a different way with a different kind of structure that'll help fund the kind of research that people see that needs to happen that doesn't quite fit what a company should do or really what an academic lab should do. So there's an organization called Convergent Research that's funding that kind of stuff and trying to find those kinds of gaps and the kinds of gaps in the institutions. So like that's just one example again of like new ways that people are approaching like how we fund and structure the scientific discovery process.
So you're telling me there's innovation yet in science?
Yes.
All right. Well, given everything that we've talked about, I appreciate this kind of conversation. I want more people to have it. What advice do you have for, let's say, both product managers and scientists on what they could be doing to make their work more impactful?
This is such a fun question because I think I actually have a question back to you. So like my impression again, like for scientists, we want to make impact, but like when you're actually making impact, like when you're in the real world, it's not pure anymore. It's not necessarily like following your plans exactly as you predicted. You have to sort of be adjusting to the messiness of the world all the time. And so I'm curious if your experience, like, do you find like that people who are maybe new to product management or getting into it, like that there's a sense of like, well, I made the roadmap and I made the plan and like, we're going to do the plan and we're going to make the product and it's going to work. But like that they sort of struggle with that moment of like meeting the real world and like, or are they like more ready for it because it's like built into the way, the mindset?
It depends on what kinds of principles they follow as product managers. And the reason why I say that is the way that we like to, so at Productside, when we go and we try to teach new product managers or even product managers who've been doing it for a while, but maybe struggle with what you're saying, is that there's so much unknown out in the world that putting a roadmap together really should be about putting a roadmap of what outcomes you're trying to drive and the experimentation that you do on a day-to-day, all that discovery work as well as the experimentation validation of your assumptions should be as small as possible. And you need to get used to most of them not working out. So that's something that if you are going to be in the product management career, you need to be very comfortable with. And it sounds like for scientists as well. I mean, and I even think about it, and maybe this thought came into my head. I empathize a lot with product teams where they were not put in a situation where they could validate early and realize whatever they're working on isn't going to be viable. And those teams end up sometimes putting in years of their career into a product that has no adoption out in market. That, outside of the business financial loss, that is a people loss. Like those are 2 years, 3 years of people's valuable time spent on something that's not valuable. And so that's why I say, at Productside, we really try to break it down into these smaller bets so that you don't end up in that kind of situation. I don't know if that's true in science, right? Sometimes,
Yeah.
especially with pharmaceuticals, right, it takes a long time to know whether or not something's going to work out. And so you have to that's part of, I think that's like a feature in some ways in those kinds of longer cycles versus where we're talking about software where you can get this immediate user feedback. Did I get your answer to your question?
No, I think you did. So I think it's great. So I think you're saying you're even trying to make sure in the training that people are kind of staying in it and iterating quickly, and going to where they can get that kind of feedback that matters most. I think, there's a sense or fear that I hear from scientists and a sort of anxiety about sort of what it looks like to do the real impact work. We want the impact, but it's too hard. It's too far away. It's too messy. It's not pure anymore. It's not research. It's something else. My advice to people is always be in it, be with it. There's a writer I love. Her name is Donna Haraway. She was a scientist and sort of became this philosopher of science. And she talks a lot about staying with the trouble. And exactly this, science and the world and technology is messy. It is full of trouble. And the way that we live through that and work through that is not to retreat into our labs, but to stay with the trouble. And I think that's maybe what you're saying too, that being in it and doing those fast iterations and trying to always test it into the real world is what matters.
I would agree with you. And I also, that so resonates. Can you send me the book that you just mentioned? Because I think that's true, by the way, applied not just in science or in career. You got to lean into it in your life. The world really is messy, and it's almost reflective of a growth mindset of you want to accept the world as it is and overcome each challenge because it's a blessing, not a curse, right? So, Christina, I absolutely love this conversation. Thanks for joining me. Where can our listeners, how can they stay in touch or follow you after they hear this recording?
So I am writing periodically on my Substack, which is at oscillator.blog, getting into some of these things again, what is the way we make science, and how does science make impact? So maybe that's the best way for people to keep in touch.
Wonderful, Christina. We're going to share a link to that in the webpage where you find this, where you find your podcasts. And if you have found our conversation fun, valuable, interesting today, please don't keep it to yourself.
Thank you for tuning into Productside Stories. I hope today's insights inspire you and propel your product journey forward. Remember, every challenge is a lesson waiting to be learned. And you can also visit us at productside.com for more free resources, like webinars, templates, playbooks, and other product wisdom repackaged for you. I'm Rina Alexin, and until next time, keep innovating, keep leading, and keep creating stories worth sharing.